Welcome back, folks, to Film Studies, and we have been talking about the evolution of film from showing to telling, and we went from things like the kinetoscope with films that were made in Edison's Black Maria studio in New Jersey that were exhibitionist in nature, to the beginnings of narratives, stories. And we have seen the Great Train Robbery that was roughly a 12-minute film that told the story of a train being robbed. Problem with the Great Train Robbery, even though it was an incredible film, was that it wasn't exactly a film that allowed for a complicated narrative because of the time constraints of the one reel, where you could only get a max of about 12 to 15 minutes worth of film onto that reel. So you didn't have any character development or anything like that. As time moved on, as we've said, Americans wanted bigger, better films. They wanted a way to be able to tell more complicated narratives and have character development and real stories unfold before them. So today, what we are going to be doing is examining the very first great Hollywood blockbuster, guys. And we are talking about a film produced by and directed by D.W. Griffith, one of the most famous, influential directors in American history. And this film is considered the very first Hollywood blockbuster. Now, just fair warning, you're going to be quite horrified by the end of today's presentation. And if you're not, I'm probably going to go home and pray for you, because what you're going to hear is really offensive and horrifying and just horrifying in general. However, this director sets the standard by which all Hollywood blockbusters in the future will be measured, by combining the techniques of all other directors up until this point into one film. So let's talk a little bit about this movie. All right, so as I mentioned momentarily a few moments ago, primitive cinema presented events but provided little or no reading of them. Events spoke for themselves without the intervention of a narrator, kind of like we saw with the Great Train Robbery with, there wasn't subtitles or anything like that, or narrating presence that attempted to read or interpret them for the audience. Stories were told directly. The camera did not read events, but merely recorded them instead. Film directors like D.W. Griffith, who carefully crafted narrative persona for themselves, provided new audiences with the kinds of narratives with which they were familiar in the theater or in literature. The cinema of D.W. Griffith actively narrated events, shaping the audience's perception of them. This was accompanied in a variety of ways, but chief among them, for Griffith at least, was the device of parallel editing, which involves cutting back and forth from two or more simultaneous events taking place in separate spheres. One of the great reasons why D.W. Griffith, in addition to legitimately being a great director, is famous is, as I heard said once before, D.W. Griffith brought the wind and the trees to film, meaning that he brought a realism to the movies that had not really existed on the level that he brings it before. So he brings subtleties of realism to the screen that had not really existed before. I wouldn't say that D.W. Griffith necessarily invented anything new. What he is going to do is bring all of the known techniques of filmmaking at the time together into one epic movie. And when I say epic movie, we're talking about the biggest movie that had ever been made, and the most expensive movie that had ever been made, and the highest grossing film that had ever been made up until 1937, guys. So we're talking about a very accomplished director who did know what he was doing. it's too bad he's going to make a film that argues for evil, unfortunately. So there's Griffith on the left, and there we can see him again. I'm going to bring my cursor up here on the right to circle Griffith there for you. And he's been captured in commemorative coins and postage stamps and things like that. But he legitimately was a brilliant filmmaker. As narratives became more complex, the 1,000-foot, one-reel, 10 to 15-minute format of the one-reel motion picture, which had only recently become an industry-wide standard in 1908, became more and more restrictive. So D.W. Griffith was one of the first directors to say, you know what, we need longer movies, multiple reel films, so we can tell a more complicated story. There's his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. It was suggested by some that longer, multiple reel films would do better justice to great operas or popular literary subjects, and it was also believed that the longer the pictures, the more exhibitors could charge to actually see them. The financial success of multiple reel European films prompted American producers to release longer and longer movies, such as biblical ethics that were released by Griffith as well. D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, which was 12 reels long, that was released in 1915, sustained an intricate narrative for 3 hours of screen time that held audiences completely spellbound. Now, if you've had any history classes at all before, 1915 was a significant year for a number of reasons. America was obviously not involved in World War I yet, but we were well on our way. But more significantly for this film, it was the 50th anniversary of the end of the American Civil War. So America was awash in nostalgia. There were several veterans of the Civil War left, and everybody was interested in the nostalgia of the war between the states. So yes, I'm sure you're looking at this particular picture now in horror, because what I'm about to tell you will absolutely horrify you. D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation is a film about the Civil War and a film about Reconstruction that argues for evil. I'm just going to go ahead and just say straight up evil. D.W. Griffith retells the Civil War with his heroes, the Ku Klux Klan, during the Reconstruction phase of the film, which defend and protect not just the South, but the entire nation, he is arguing, from the villains, which are the mean old Yankees and African Americans, who D.W. Griffith sees as trying to take over our country. And it's going to be up to, the Ku Klux Klan to rein in his quote-unquote villains. Now, this film is actually still used today as a recruiting tool for the Ku Klux Klan, which unfortunately is still very much alive and well and just as nutty as ever. So I'm sure that image quite horrified you. The Birth of a Nation premiered with the title The Klansman and is a 1915 silent film directed by D.W. Griffith. Set during and after the American Civil War, the film was based on Thomas Dixon's book called The Klansman, a novel and play. The Birth of a Nation is noted for its innovative camera techniques and narrative achievements and its status as the very first Hollywood blockbuster, and has provoked great controversy for promoting white supremacy and its positive portrayal of the Ku Klux Klan. D.W. Griffith's budget started at about $40,000, but the film finally ended up costing $112,000, roughly between $2.5 to $3 million today. As a result, Griffith had to seek new sources of capital for his film. A ticket to the film cost a record $2 at the time, the equivalent of around $45 to $50 today. Now, guys, I don't know about you all, but $50 a ticket is a heck of a lot of money. And it costs me enough whenever I go with my family to the movies. You're talking, you're not getting out of there today for a family of 3, in my case, for under $75 to $100 after you've bought tickets, after you've bought a Coke and popcorn. It's expensive to go to the movies. It really is. But a family of 4, $200 to go see a movie in adjusted dollars today, that would be an insane amount of money. So people paid it, though. I mean, it was so popular. And guys, it was the most profitable film in American history until it was dethroned by Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937. Really ironic that such a sweet film made by the great Walt Disney would dethrone such an evil film made by D.W. Griffith. Running for 44 consecutive weeks at the Liberty Theater in New York City, the success of The Birth of a Nation transformed the nature of American film production, and I'm going to circle that with my cursor. Exhibition. Guys, it's a 3-hour movie. You've got bigger, better films. You've got D.W. Griffith making the very first great Hollywood blockbuster that's going to set the standard for all major films to come. But you're also going to need bigger, better places to watch the films. And we're going to be talking about the birth of the movie palaces in our next discussion. But the birth essentially marks the end of the Nickelodeon storefront theater and introduced the grandeur of a great orchestra and a grand picture in the movie palaces, which are on the way. You're not going to want to sit in that Nickelodeon for 3 hours in those uncomfortable chairs that we looked at. The birth was notorious for several reasons, but chief among them its racist agenda. The Birth of a Nation illustrated the enormous power of the motion picture to communicate ideological arguments. So this is going to teach the world a very, very dangerous lesson, guys, that film can be used to manipulate hearts and minds. And of course, later on, the Nazis are going to use this, as well as other totalitarian governments, to begin making propaganda films. So this film is nothing more than a propaganda film that is intended to portray a telling of the Civil War and Reconstruction from a very white Southern point of view, told from a very racist perception, a very pro-South perception. So Griffith is going to retell the story of the American Civil War and Reconstruction with his villains, African Americans, and the white politicians in the North who were determined to, quote, overthrow civilization in the South, unquote, and, quote, put the white South under the heel of the black South, unquote. So Griffith definitely has a racist agenda in this movie. Now, one of the things that characterizes the film, again, which is horrifying enough with its positive portrayal of the Ku Klux Klan, many of the actors in the movie that portray African Americans are white actors who appear in blackface, which of course today is extremely offensive, but at that time was quite popular in things like minstrel shows, where white actors would paint their faces black and attempt to portray African Americans. Terribly offensive. African Americans did not appreciate that, rightfully so then, and they certainly, of course, don't appreciate that now. But there are African Americans in this movie, but they play characters in the background. They aren't given any leading roles. But this is a slave who has been charged with a crime, and he is being tried, quote unquote, tried by the Klan. Yeah, I'll bet that'll be a real fair trial. For D.W. Griffith, the birth of a nation depended on the subjugation of the African American and the restoration of white privilege. The Birth of a Nation pioneered such camera techniques as deep focus, jump cut, and facial close-ups, which are now considered integral to the industry. It also contained many new cinematic innovations, special effects, and artistic techniques. For this reason, it was voted one of the top 100 American films of all time, coming in at number 44 by the American Film Institute. I think what Griffith does better than anything in this movie is utilize parallel editing. Parallel editing says, essentially, quote, meanwhile, unquote. For example, while one event is happening, the subtitles, meanwhile, back at the Cameron home, you'll see what's going on at the exact same time in just a different location. That's called parallel editing. And Edwin S. Porter and his Life of an American Fireman really was one of the first great pioneers of parallel editing. So the parallel editing, events that are going on at the exact same time. In 1992, the United States Library of Congress deemed The Birth of a Nation one of our culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant films and selected it for preservation in the National Film Registry. Despite its controversial subject matter, the film has been praised by film critics like Roger Ebert, who's my all-time favorite film critic who passed away several years ago. And what Roger Ebert said was that, quote, "The Birth of a Nation is not a bad movie because it argues for evil. To understand how it does so and to learn a great deal about film and even something about evil." So what Roger Ebert is saying is that The Birth of a Nation isn't a bad film per se just because it's arguing for something evil. The film, the way it's put together, is quite brilliant and studied to this day by film studies students all over the country. What Roger Ebert is saying is even though it argues for evil, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's to be completely dismissed. The techniques that D.W. Griffith introduces, the parallel editing, the jump cuts, and there are so many things. The character development, the epic battle scenes of the Civil War. Nobody had ever seen anything like those. And one that I'm going to show you here in just a few moments, the Lincoln assassination, is done so well that you literally feel like you're seeing Lincoln himself assassinated. It's really a work of art in its own right. So here are a couple theatrical posters for The Birth of a Nation. And like I said, this film ran for weeks and weeks and weeks and made tons of money. The Birth of a Nation renders American history as melodrama. The theatrical genre of melodrama uses theme music to manipulate the spectator's emotional response and to denote character types. Starting with mostly original score composed by Joseph Carr Briel for D.W. Griffith's groundbreaking epic The Birth of a Nation, it became relatively common for the biggest budgeted Hollywood films to arrive at the exhibiting theaters with original, specifically composed scores that would be accompanied by organs and orchestras and played so that the mood of what was happening on the screen would match the music. So here is Dr. Joseph Carr Briel, the very first person to compose a score specifically for a motion picture. And so when The Birth of a Nation showed up in theaters, it also came with a piece of music, and you were to play that music in accordance with the film so that the music would match the mood on the screen. First time that had ever happened. So what I would like to do now is show you guys a little bit of The Birth of a Nation and the Lincoln assassination. So this is a scene from the film. There are a lot of scenes that I could show you, epic battles and other things. As horrifying as the film is, again, one cannot disagree with the fact that Griffith was a brilliant director. Now this is supposed to be Ford's Theater, and there we have Lillian Gish, who was the most famous actress in the film. She was America's hottie in Hollywood at the time, and Griffith worked with her on several occasions. The guy he selected to play Abraham Lincoln was on point. And here we have an almost exact replica of Ford's Theater. And the play that Lincoln was watching on the night of his assassination was called Our American Cousin. It was a comedy. He had actually seen it several times before, and he knew exactly, what he was going to see. Here we come at 8:30. President and Mrs. Lincoln come to sit down in the presidential box. And now this really happened. This is, even though a lot of what is in this movie is completely historically inaccurate with a racist agenda, Griffith gets this right. What we see here is really on point. You can see that eerily looks just like Abraham Lincoln. And there's Lillian Gish on the right there, one of the most famous actresses in all the silent era. And so that really happened. People stopped. People gave him a standing ovation. This was right after Lee surrendered, and he told Mary Todd that Lincoln that they needed to go and do something extremely happy. So here we see them sitting in the box. Mr. Lincoln takes his seat, and the play resumes. Now, this is one of the most epic fails in American history. Lincoln took one bodyguard with him to Ford's Theater because, as he had told Mary Todd on a number of occasions, if a man truly has it in his heart to kill me, there's really nothing that can be done to stop him. So one bodyguard came and sat outside the presidential booth. No pun. While this was happening, and while the play was going on, a very famous actor by the name of John Wilkes Booth, who had been planning for some time to kidnap the president, but not more than a couple weeks prior to this decided to try and assassinate him, heard that Lincoln was coming that evening and knew every in and out of that theater. Now here you can see this bozo. The most epic fail, I would argue, in American history. You had one job, buddy, and he decides to go, and it was just killing him that this was a comedy and that people were enjoying themselves. So he takes the chair and leaves the protection of President Lincoln and goes to watch the play. And you can see Lillian Gish saying, "Now, who's that handsome man? What a good-looking guy." Oh. So there's John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth, guys, was one of the most famous actors in the entire world at the time. It was kind of the equivalent of George Clooney in terms of his stardom. Abraham Lincoln was a fan, ironically enough, of John Wilkes Booth. So here we see that Booth sees that the bodyguard has left. Booth knew every in and out of Ford's Theater. He had been an actor on that stage many times. His very favorite role was Julius Caesar, ironically enough, or favorite play, rather, was Julius Caesar. So here we're going to see him creep off and exit out the door. He had a Derringer with him, which was a small, tiny gun that was often kept in women's handbags and under men's hats because it was so tiny. So he takes out his Derringer, and he enters the presidential box and shoots Lincoln behind the ear. And Lincoln immediately slumped over, lost consciousness, never to regain it. And Booth, as you're going to see, after he shoots the president, is going to leap over the presidential booth onto the floor, breaking his leg. He waited for the loudest line of applause in Our American Cousin. So we see he shoots him behind the left ear and jumps onto the stage, breaks his leg, and says, "Sic semper tyrannis," which means in Latin, "and thus always to tyrants," sort of the equivalent of killing off Julius Caesar. And he runs out the back of the theater and jumps on a horse where a guy named Davy Harrell is waiting with him. So as you can see, Mary Todd screamed, Lincoln loses consciousness, and is going to be carried across the street to a boarding house where he will die very early the next morning. So this scene is done so insanely well, guys. I mean, Griffith got that so right. And it's as tragic here as it was when it really happened. But for all the terrible things that D.W. Griffith argued for in this film, there are some very important things that we can learn about movie making from this film. Now, guys, I will tell you that in theaters where the film was shown, when the film was over with, it caused such anger in a lot of white Americans, that they reacted violently in some cases against African Americans who had been portrayed as villains in the film. African Americans were beaten, hit, punched, all kinds of terrible things that happened. D.W. Griffith apparently did feel bad about making this movie because the next year he would begin making a movie called Intolerance about how various groups of people have been discriminated against over the years, but the damage had been done. And to this day, much of the perception we have of Reconstruction comes directly from this movie. I mentioned that it was still used as a recruiting tool by the Ku Klux Klan to this date. But as evil and awful and horrible as it is, there's a great deal we can learn from this film about movie making. And again, the lesson it will teach the world that you can use film to brainwash and manipulate and make people believe in a particular point of view. And that's going to be important when we start looking at propaganda film. So remember that. But yeah, this was the highest grossing film until 1937, guys. Unbelievable. I hope you took something from this, and at least now you know what the first great Hollywood epic was. And up next, we're going to be looking at bigger, better places to watch, bigger, better movies, the birth of the movie palaces. Till next time, guys.